Auckland Castle is delighted to host this exhibition, Plots and Spangles, in association with Stonyhurst College. It reunites the vestments created by Helena Wintour over 400 years ago. So we chose the title Plots and Spangles because Helena Wintour's father was executed for his part in the Gunpowder Plot when she was just 6 years old. It also reflects the brilliance and the splendour of the vestments, as spangles are a form of sequin which are used heavily in the embroidery work.
The inspiration for the exhibition was really this idea that we had this wonderful collection of vestments. We have about 300 altogether, but within that collection was a special group which were exquisitely embroidered and very different in design, and they were done and embroidered by a known woman. And I think we started off from the point of who was this woman and why did she produce these beautiful and extraordinary vestments. Helena Wintour was a 17th century single woman who made her life remarkable by reading and acts of devotion and extraordinary creativity. Most of her inspiration came from her reading and her gardens and the countryside around her. And she, I think, devised this deep spirituality from what had happened to her family. Probably by the time she was 10, she was an orphan. And she lived with her older brother and his wife and helped look after their babies. And her life was spent sheltering priests, developing her faith and making these beautiful embroideries. Helena grew up in a very different world from the one that we inhabit. You can't imagine people being forbidden on penalty of death or life imprisonment to practice their faith. The penalties for Catholics increased exponentially after the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. So to hold a priest in your house meant that you would be executed if you were caught. It's perhaps surprising that Helena signed some of her embroideries. Her name was associated with treason and with Catholicism, and it was illegal to make or to house these vestments. So putting her name on them was a pretty defiant act of personal rebellion. Towards the end of her life, she was clearly worried about what would happen to these vestments after her death. She'd outlived every member of her family, so there was no obvious person to leave them to. And she very much wanted them to be used. And she made it very clear in her dying wishes on the day of her death. In fact, she signed a document saying that they were to be left to the Jesuits. Unfortunately, her niece by marriage, Lady Mary, turned up and started demanding the vestments and threatening exposure to the authorities. And so the Jesuits decided that they couldn't possibly risk being arrested and probably executed. So they gave Lady Mary half of the set. And the other half were used by the Jesuits in and around Worcester until they came to Stonyhurst in the 1850s. A lot of people wonder how on earth one woman could have produced so much work. I like to think that she used her work a little bit like a sodality, like a prayer group, where you'd have a number of women. Maybe one would be reading some prayers or some devotional work, and the others would be sitting quietly sewing. And that practical work was also an offering to God of her creativity and the work of her hands. And she didn't skimp on the money spent on those. It was only the best gold thread and the best silks. A lot of the jewels that you can see on the vestments came from her jewellery box. There are some garnet earrings which are sewn into the white vestments, and there are seed pearls which I suspect she had strung together as a set of necklaces and so on. So she put her own jewels into these vestments as much as she put her own income into them. She would have regarded that as a suitable way of spending her money to glorify God.